My parents forgot my birthday for years, so I left, and they still didn't realize. I always understood I was the easy child. My parents made that clear early on. Ryan, you're so independent. You don't need as much as Madison, they would say, and I believed them. I tried to be understanding and accept that my younger sister required more care, attention, and love. But even the easy kids need something. When I was younger, I imagined big birthday parties and surprises waiting for me when I woke up. But by the time I turned 8, I had already learned to set my expectations lower. That year, I still clung to a tiny bit of hope. I remember waking up with the sunlight pouring through my window thinking, maybe, just maybe they've planned something for me. I walked into the kitchen, still in my pajamas, hoping for balloons or at least a happy birthday greeting. Instead, my mom was packing a bag, putting in medication and extra blankets, while my dad read through a medical bill, sipping his coffee. I cheerfully said, "Good morning," waiting for a sign that today was special. "Morning, honey," my mom said distractedly. "Get some cereal. We have to take Madison to the specialist today." I hesitated. "Right. Today's my—" A sudden groan from the couch interrupted me. Madison, curled up, clutching her stomach, whimpered in pain. My mom rushed to her side, stroking her hair, and my dad quickly grabbed the car keys. I stood there helpless while they hurried out the door, my mom calling back, "We'll be back later, Ryan. Be good." And then the door slammed. That was the first time they forgot my birthday, but not the last. Later that evening, when they finally returned, they were exhausted but cheerful. "Madison was so brave today," my dad said, ruffling her hair. "The doctor said she's improving a little." I forced a smile. "That's great." It wasn't until the next morning that my mom suddenly gasped while pouring her coffee. "Oh my God," she muttered. "Ryan, yesterday was your birthday, wasn't it?" I nodded slowly, staring at my untouched breakfast. She rushed over, squeezing my shoulders. "I'm so sorry, baby. Things have just been so hectic. We'll do something later this week, okay?" But later never came. Instead, she handed me a $5 gift card, the kind kept near checkout lanes for last-minute shoppers. "Go get yourself something nice," she said with a tired smile. It was meant to make up for it, but all it did was confirm what I had already suspected. I didn't matter. As the years went by, I became used to being an afterthought. School events, soccer games, even simple weekend outings. I was always the one left behind. It wasn't because they didn't love me. It was just that Madison needed them more. At least that's what I told myself. When I turned 10, I dared to hope again. Being in double digits seemed like a big deal, something worth celebrating. I had been dropping hints for weeks, talking about the arcade downtown, mentioning how cool a pizza party at home would be. My friends were all having parties, their parents making a big deal of them. And I thought maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. But as the day approached, there were no whispers of secret plans, no gifts hidden around the house, no excitement. On the morning of my birthday, I came downstairs, heart racing, searching their faces for any sign of recognition. But there was nothing. Just my mom on the phone, scheduling a new therapy session for Madison, and my dad already dressed for work. No happy birthday, no smile. I sat at the table, staring at my cereal as they talked about Madison's pain levels, her new medication, and how they needed to adjust her schedule. I could feel the words rise in my throat, but I swallowed them down. What was the point? It wouldn't make them remember. It wouldn't make them care. At least at school, my friends remembered. Chris, my best friend, grinned as he handed me a crumpled dollar bill and some coins. "We all pitched in," he said proudly, giving me a small cup of ice cream from the cafeteria. I laughed, pretending it was enough, and maybe for a moment it was. But when I got home, reality set back in. There was no surprise waiting for me, no cake, no mention of my birthday at all. My mom was too busy, my dad was working late, and Madison had been having a rough day, so everything focused on making her comfortable. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it didn't matter. It was just a day. The next morning my mom finally realized. "Oh, Ryan," she sighed, guilt written all over her face. "I'm sorry. Things have just been so crazy." She promised we'd do something over the weekend. The weekend came, and Madison wasn't feeling well. Instead of a celebration, we spent the day watching her favorite movies. My dad picked up a small grocery store cake, vanilla, not even my favorite, and set it on the counter with a quiet, happy late birthday. I nodded, but inside something shifted. It wasn't about the cake or presents. It was the realization that I would always come second. By the time I turned 12, I had stopped hoping entirely. I didn't drop hints. I didn't ask for anything. I woke up, did my homework, played video games, and helped around the house. This time, at least they remembered to say happy birthday. My mom gave me a quick hug, my dad clapped me on the shoulder, and that was it. No party, no special dinner, just another day in a house where I felt more like a guest than a son. I think that birthday hurt the most, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of how painfully normal it was. It wasn't neglect out of cruelty, it was just habit. Over time, I learned to stop expecting. I focused on school, soccer, anything that made me feel like I mattered. I spent more time at Chris's house, where his parents actually asked about my day, where I was invited to stay for dinner without being an afterthought. When I got my first A on a big test, I brought it home, excited to show my parents. My mom glanced at it, nodded approvingly, and then immediately returned to discussing Madison's latest doctor visit. I never brought home another test again. Instead, I began waiting for the day I could leave. By the time I reached my teenage years, I had stopped expecting my parents to notice me. It wasn't that they were cruel or openly dismissive. It was just that their world revolved around Madison, and I was the easy one, the healthy one, the kid who could fend for himself. I figured that if I didn't ask for much, I might avoid disappointment. When I turned 13, I had a soccer game I'd been looking forward to for weeks, the semifinals of our district tournament. I knew my parents were busy, but I still mentioned it to them a few times. They gave me vague nods and the usual half-hearted, "We'll try to make it," but deep down, I knew they wouldn't come. Still, a tiny part of me held on to hope. The game was incredible. I scored the winning goal in the last few minutes, and my teammates swarmed me, cheering. The coach ruffled my hair, telling me I had talent. Parents crowded the field, hugging their kids, taking pictures, celebrating. And me? I just stood there, glancing at the empty bleachers. Chris's parents came over instead. "You were amazing, Ryan," his mom beamed, giving me a side hug. "You should have seen yourself out there, kid." "You've got a real gift," his dad added, clapping me on the back. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks." Chris must have noticed something on my face because as we walked toward the locker rooms, he nudged me. "They didn't come, did they?" he asked. I shrugged. "They're busy," I said. It wasn't a lie. When I got home, my mom was at the kitchen table, filling out insurance forms. Madison was asleep on the couch, pale and exhausted. My dad was on the phone, speaking in a low, serious voice. I stood in the doorway for a moment, wondering if I should say something. Then I saw my test from school sitting on the counter. I had gotten a 98% on my math exam, a huge deal for me. I had left it there that morning, hoping someone would notice. It was still there, untouched, as if it had never been. I turned around and walked back to my room without a word. At 15, I began spending even more time away from home. If I wasn't at soccer practice, I was at Chris's house or wandering around town. Anywhere but home. There I was just a shadow. It didn't matter if I was excelling in school or struggling. If I was happy or miserable, no one really saw me. My grandparents were the only ones who made me feel like I existed. Grandma Jean had a way of making even the smallest things special. Every time I visited, she'd pull out her old, stained recipe book and let me pick something to bake. "You're in charge today, Chef Ryan," she'd say with a grin, tying an apron around my waist. I didn't care about baking, not really, but I cared about those afternoons. They were mine. Grandpa Walter was quieter, but just as steady. His basement was filled with model trains, a whole miniature world he had built with his own hands. Sometimes I'd sit with him for hours as he adjusted tiny houses and trees, making sure everything was just right. "It's about the little things," he would say. "The details matter, even if no one notices them." He didn't know how much I needed to hear that. When I turned 16, things at home hit a breaking point. Madison had been having a particularly rough week, and the atmosphere in the house felt more oppressive than usual. I had learned to keep my head down, to stay out of the way when tensions ran high. But one evening, while I was in my room playing a game, one of the few things that allowed me to escape, even if just for a while, Madison barged in. "Turn it off," she snapped. I barely glanced up. "It's not even that loud." I don't care. I don't feel good, she snapped again. I sighed but kept playing. It was one of the few times I had something to myself, and I wasn't about to give it up so easily. She didn't argue, but instead stormed over, grabbed one of the controllers, and threw it. It crashed against the wall and fell to the floor. I jumped up. Are you kidding me? She didn't even look guilty. I told you to turn it off. My parents rushed in at the noise. Their eyes immediately went to Madison, who was now crying. What happened? My mom demanded. She broke my stuff, I said, gesturing to the controller and the broken console on the floor. Madison dramatically wiped her tears. I didn't mean to. I was just in pain, and he wouldn't listen. And just like that, I was the villain. Ryan, my dad sighed, running a hand over his face. Come on, she's having a rough time, you know that? Yeah, well, so am I snapped. But I guess that doesn't matter, does it? My mom looked at me exasperated. Ryan, we don't have time for this. Of course they didn't. I didn't say another word. I just turned around, walked out of the room, and slammed the door behind me. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing something I'd probably known deep down. Nothing I did would ever be as important as Madison's needs. I could scream, break things, or disappear for days, and they still wouldn't see me. The next morning, my mom knocked on my door, hesitant. Ryan, we're thinking about trying family therapy. Would you be open to that? I almost laughed. Therapy? After 16 years of being ignored, what was the point? But a small, desperate part of me still wanted to believe that things could change, so I nodded. Yeah, okay. Maybe, just maybe, they'd finally hear me. I started coming home later and later. At first, my parents didn't even notice. I'd stay at Chris's house after school, help him and his dad work on their car in the garage, or spend hours at the park just to kill time. Being anywhere else felt better than being home. One evening, I walked through the front door, and my mom barely looked up from the dinner table. You need to start telling me where you are, she said, absently cutting Madison's food into small pieces. I dropped my backpack near the couch. I'm always at Chris's. You should be home, she said. We don't know what's going on with you lately. I almost laughed. They had spent my entire life acting like I wasn't there, and now they wanted to know where I'd been. Instead of arguing, I grabbed a plate and helped myself to some leftovers from the fridge. Madison had a rough day, my dad said after a moment, rubbing his face. Her pain's been worse. The doctor's adjusting her meds again. I nodded, already knowing what would come next. The same exhausting cycle, the same discussions, the same concerns. They never asked about my day, my school, my friends, or anything I did. A few nights later, I overheard my mom talking to my dad while I was in the hallway, just out of sight. I'm worried about Ryan, she said, her voice hushed. He's just being a teenager, my dad replied. You know how they are. No, it's different, she insisted. He barely speaks to us anymore. I don't know what's going on in his head. I stood there waiting, hoping to hear something that showed they were beginning to understand what they had done, hoping they realized how much they had ignored me. But instead, my dad said, Lisa, we don't have time to deal with this right now. Madison needs us. We'll talk to Ryan when things settle down. That was all I needed to hear. They didn't realize they were losing me. And worse, they didn't care enough to fix it. That night, I sat in my room, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about the birthdays they had forgotten, the games they had missed, the way I had always been expected to understand while no one ever tried to understand me. If I didn't say something soon, nothing would ever change. The next morning over breakfast, I put my spoon down and said, We need to talk. My parents looked up, startled. Even Madison glanced at me, confused. What is it, honey? My mom asked. I took a deep breath. I think we need therapy. Silence, then my dad frowned. Therapy? What for? I swallowed hard. Because I feel like I don't exist in this house. My mom looked at me like I had just spoken a foreign language. Ryan, of course you exist. What are you talking about? You don't see me, I said, my voice steady but firm. Everything is about Madison. Every conversation, every plan, every decision, it's always her first, and I just exist around it. My dad's jaw tightened. Ryan, that's not fair. You know how complicated things are. I shook my head. I'm not saying Madison doesn't need you. I'm saying I need you too. And I've been waiting my whole life for you to see that. My mom looked at me, her eyes glossy. We never meant to make you feel that way. But you did, I said. And if we don't fix it now, we never will. They didn't agree right away, but later that night, my mom knocked on my door. Okay, we'll try therapy. For the first time in years, I felt like I had been heard, but I had no idea what I was walking into. The first therapy session felt awkward from the moment we walked in. The room was small with soft lighting and a few chairs arranged in a circle. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Harris, smiled warmly and asked us to sit. My parents looked tense, sitting close together, while Madison sat curled up in her chair, like she didn't even want to be there. I sat across from them, feeling like an outsider in my own family. "So Ryan," Dr. Harris began, "your parents tell me you've been feeling left out. Can you tell me more about that?" I hesitated. I wasn't sure where to start. There were too many moments, too many birthdays forgotten, too many times I felt like a ghost in my own home. "I just feel like I don't matter," I finally said. "Like I could disappear and nothing would change." My mom inhaled sharply. "Ryan, that's not true." "Isn't it?" I shot back. "You don't even notice when I'm not there. You didn't come to a single one of my soccer games. You forgot my birthday multiple times. You don't ask about school or my friends or anything I do. The only time you ever really talk to me is when it's about Madison." Silence hung between us. My dad looked down at his hands. My mom opened her mouth, but no words came out. Dr. Harris nodded. "Lisa, Mark, do you see where Ryan is coming from?" My mom let out a shaky breath. "I do," she admitted. "But it's not because we don't care. We love you, Ryan. It's just that Madison needs so much from us. And sometimes it feels like there's no time for anything else." I clenched my jaw. "That's the thing, Mom. It's always about Madison. Always. And I've spent my entire life just dealing with it. But I'm tired of feeling like I don't exist." Madison finally spoke up, her voice sharp. "So what? You want me to apologize for being sick?" I turned to her, anger flaring in my chest. "No, Madison. I want Mom and Dad to admit that I deserve to be part of this family too." The session ended without any real resolution. My parents promised they'd try harder, that they'd make more of an effort, and for a little while they did. We started having family nights once a week, movies, board games, even a trip to a museum. At first it felt nice, like maybe things could actually change, but Madison didn't like it. She started making little comments, passive-aggressive jabs about how much fun we must have had without her. "It's fine," she'd say, her voice tight. "I don't mind being left out." The guilt worked like a charm. One night during dinner, she finally broke down, tears streaming down her face. "You're spending less time with me," she sobbed. "It feels like I'm not important anymore." My parents immediately rushed to comfort her. "Oh, sweetheart, that's not true," my mom soothed. "We love you so much." I don't want to be forgotten," Madison sniffled. And just like that, everything shifted. The outing stopped, and the focus snapped back to Madison. I should have seen it coming. A few weeks later, in another therapy session, Madison made an accusation that took the air out of me. "Mom and Dad love Ryan more," she said, her voice trembling, "because he's normal." I stared at her stunned. "What?" My parents looked horrified. "Madison, no," my dad said. "That's not true at all." "It feels like it," she insisted. "Ever since we started trying to make Ryan happy, I feel like I don't matter anymore." I let out a hollow laugh. "Are you serious? I've spent my whole life being ignored. And now, after a few weeks of getting a little attention, you're acting like I've stolen everything from you?" Madison wiped her tears. "You wouldn't understand." The session ended in chaos. My parents were flustered, trying to reassure her, and the therapist struggled to keep things from spiraling. But I knew then that nothing was ever going to change. When we got home that night, my mom pulled me aside. "Maybe we should try a different therapist," she said carefully. "Someone who can help us all feel heard." I shook my head. I saw right through it. They wanted someone who would tell them what they wanted to hear, someone who would justify why they always put Madison first. "No," I said simply, "I'm done." She looked hurt. "Ryan, please." "I'm done trying," I repeated. "It doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't matter what I do. This is never going to change." I walked away before she could say anything else. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, just like I had on all those forgotten birthdays, all those lonely nights. Only this time I wasn't hoping anymore. I was planning my escape. The night I decided to leave, I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I just felt done. I had spent years hoping, waiting for my parents to see me, to recognize that I was part of the family too. But after that last therapy session, after hearing Madison twist the situation into something it wasn't, after watching my parents scramble to comfort her while my feelings were once again ignored, I knew it was over. I knew at that point I had nothing left to give. I started planning right away. I didn't have much money, but I had saved up from a part-time job I worked after school. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. College was approaching, and while my parents had always assumed I'd attend the local university, I decided to apply to a place far away, somewhere they wouldn't expect. A few weeks later, I received an acceptance letter. A college 3 states away had offered me a scholarship. It wasn't a full ride, but it was enough to get me started. That night, I sat at the dinner table, waiting for the right moment to tell them. Madison was talking about a new treatment plan, my mom listening intently, and my dad nodding along. I waited for a break in the conversation, a pause to speak, but it never came. So I spoke anyway. I got into college, I said, my voice steady. My mom glanced at me. That's great, honey, she said, but she was still focused on Madison. I'm moving out in August, I added, and that got their attention. My dad put his fork down. Moving where, he asked. Out of state. Madison frowned. Why would you go that far? I shrugged. I just need a fresh start. My mom's expression tightened. Ryan, we were hoping you'd stay closer. With everything going on, we need you here. And there it was. Not we'll miss you. Not we're proud of you. Just we need you here. I pushed my chair back, stood up and said, I'm still going. They didn't fight me on it. Not really. Maybe they thought I'd changed my mind. That like everything else, I'd just let it go. But I didn't. I spent the summer packing, preparing, making sure I had everything in order. The day before I left, I visited my grandparents. Grandma Jean hugged me tightly. I always knew you'd go somewhere big, she said. Grandpa Walter handed me a small wooden train piece from his collection. For when you start building your own world, he said simply. I held on to it, my throat tight. They were the only ones who had ever made me feel like I was enough. The morning I left, my mom cried. My dad clapped me on the back and told me to be careful. Madison barely looked at me. It should have hurt, but it didn't. I was too numb for that. The drive to my new life felt surreal. I watched the familiar roads disappear in the rearview mirror, waiting for some sadness, some regret to hit me, but it never came. Instead, with every mile, I felt lighter. The first few weeks in the new city were quiet. I wasn't used to making my own rules, living without the constant noise of my family. It was strange at first, not having to check in, not being forgotten at the dinner table because there was no dinner table. I got a job, made some friends. Chris called often, checking in on me. He was the only one from home who did. My parents called a few times at first, but the conversations were brief. They'd ask how I was, but it always led back to Madison. She's been struggling lately, my mom would say. She misses you. I didn't know what to say to that. Did she miss me? Or did she just miss having me there to absorb the attention she didn't want? As the months passed, the calls became less frequent. I didn't reach out either. I was too busy figuring out who I was outside of being the forgotten son. Then my birthday came, the first one away from them. I didn't expect much, but when the day passed with no call, no text, no acknowledgement from my family at all, I realized something. I wasn't disappointed. I wasn't hurt. I just felt free. I spent that night with my new friends, people who actually cared, people who showed up. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone to remember me. I had remembered myself. The first year away from home was an adjustment, but it was the best kind of adjustment. I had spent so long feeling like an afterthought that it took time to accept that I wasn't one anymore. My life wasn't about waiting for someone to notice me. It was about deciding what I wanted and going after it. I threw myself into college, into work, into friendships that felt real. Chris and I still talked often, and he even visited once, joking that I had finally escaped my ghost status. I made new friends too, people who actually listened when I spoke, who asked how I was doing, and genuinely cared about the answer. Sophia was one of them. We met in a literature class and bonded over the fact that we were both figuring out what we wanted from life. She had a laugh that made people turn their heads, a way of making everyone feel important. Unlike my family, she noticed the little things. If I was tired, if I was off, if I was avoiding talking about something, she noticed. One day, a few months into our friendship, she called me out on it. You deflect a lot, she said casually while we sat in a coffee shop. I raised an eyebrow. Do I? She smirked. Yeah, someone asks about you, and you turn it into a joke or change the subject. It's like you don't expect people to actually care. I shrugged, taking a sip of my drink. Old habit, I guess. She leaned forward, serious now. You know you're allowed to take up space, right? You don't have to shrink yourself just because other people made you feel like you weren't worth the attention. I didn't respond right away. No one had ever put it that way before. I had spent so much time accepting that I was invisible in my own family that I hadn't realized how much that mindset had followed me into my new life. That conversation stuck with me. Slowly, I let myself open up more. I started celebrating small wins, aces, contests, promotions at work, even just making it through a tough week. When my next birthday rolled around, I didn't wait for my family to remember. I planned something for myself. It wasn't anything huge, just a night out with friends, but it was the best birthday I had ever had. We went to a bar, laughed until our sides hurt, and for once I wasn't thinking about whether my parents would call. I wasn't checking my phone for a message that wasn't coming. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I called home. My mom picked up, sounding surprised. Ryan, it's been a while. I leaned against my desk. Yeah, I've been busy. We made small talk for a bit, mostly about Madison, of course. Nothing had changed. She was still struggling, still the center of their world. Then after a pause, I asked, did you guys even realize my birthday passed? Silence. Then my mom let out a breath. Oh, Ryan, I'm so sorry. Things have been so hectic. Of course they had. I didn't get angry. I didn't even feel hurt. I just nodded even though she couldn't see me. It's okay, I said, because it was. I had spent my whole life waiting for them to show up for me, and they never had. And that was never going to change. So I stopped waiting. That was the last time I called them first. If they wanted to talk, they knew where to find me. But I wasn't going to chase after people who couldn't be bothered to remember I existed. By my third year in the city, I had built a life that felt like mine. I had friends who showed up, people who actually wanted me around. I had a job I liked, plans for the future, and a version of myself that didn't revolve around waiting for scraps of attention. When my next birthday came around, I didn't even think about my family. I threw another party, bigger this time, with music, drinks, and people who mattered. Sophia was there, laughing as she convinced me to do a ridiculous dance move. Chris made a post, joking that I had finally learned how to enjoy life. It was the happiest I had ever been. A few days later, I called home again, just to see if things had changed. They hadn't. No one had remembered. This time, I didn't even care.